At 18, her father forced her to marry a rancher, with 2 children. What happened next shocked town. The land stretched out in silence, a pale sheet of winter earth that seemed to breathe only through the low sigh of the wind. The wooden fences stood crooked, their posts leaning as if they were tired of holding themselves upright after years of carrying storms. Beyond them, a small cabin rested at the edge of the prairie, its chimney cold, its windows dim, and its walls weathered grey by seasons that had not been kind. Morning light spread thin across the horizon, not golden but pale, carrying no warmth, only a quiet heaviness that clung to the air. The place looked lived in, yet lonely, as though voices had once filled it, but had long since fallen silent. The man who walked out from the cabin moved with the heaviness of someone who had carried more years on his back than he wanted to admit. His boots crunched over the frozen ground, each step slow, not because of weakness, but because of thought. He was a rancher, broad-shouldered, with hands roughened by rope and reins, and a face carved by both sun and sorrow. His hair had begun to grey at the temples, though he was not yet an old man. He looked out over the land with the eyes of someone who had seen too much loss and too little kindness, the kind of eyes that kept their distance from hope. Behind him, faint sounds stirred from the cabin, light footsteps and the soft clink of a tin cup. 2 children emerged, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5, both bundled in clothes too big for them, both carrying the same quiet sadness in their small faces. The boy held his sister's hand with the seriousness of someone much older, guiding her down the porch steps, while the little girl clung to a ragged doll missing one arm. They did not run, laugh, or speak. Their silence was heavier than the morning air, as though words had long ago been taken from them. The rancher looked at them but said nothing, only nodded once, and they followed him across the yard, small shadows trailing a larger one. It was then the wagon appeared at the far end of the dirt road, its wheels cutting uneven tracks through the frozen earth. The horses snorted in the cold, pulling a load that seemed far too heavy for such a morning. On the back of the wagon sat a girl, young, her hands gripping the edge of the worn wooden boards as though she might fall off if she let go. She was dressed in a plain dress that was thin against the cold, her hair braided too tightly, her face pale with fear and something deeper, resignation. She was no bride in white lace, no woman stepping into marriage by choice. She was only 18, her eyes too wide for her age, her lips pressed together as though she had swallowed her voice long before the wagon began its journey. When the wagon stopped before the rancher's cabin, the driver climbed down and nodded stiffly. He did not look at the girl. He did not look at the children. He only looked at the rancher, his expression hard, his words short. Her father said, "It's done," he muttered. The girl climbed down slowly, her shoes sinking into the frozen dirt, and for a moment she stood between the rancher and the 2 children, her breath shallow, her body stiff, as though she had been placed there not by fate, but by force. The land was silent around them, the cold morning holding its breath. The rancher watched her, the children watched her, and she did not move. The girl stood in the yard, her small figure caught between the rough edges of the land and the quiet stares of those who now surrounded her. She did not cry, though her face was pale and her hands trembled where they clutched the fabric of her dress. The boy watched her with a guarded expression, as if measuring whether she was friend or straw. Anger, while the little girl tilted her head, pressing her ragged doll to her chest. The rancher's eyes stayed on her longer than he intended. He could see the way she shifted her weight, the way she kept her shoulders pulled in as if to make herself smaller. She had been trained to disappear. He knew what that looked like. He had seen it before, not just in others, but once in himself. A memory came uninvited, rising like smoke from an old fire he thought he had buried. He was younger, standing in his father's barn, his cheek raw from the back of a heavy hand, his mouth full of blood and silence. He remembered how the world felt then. Too large, too cruel, and how he had wished someone would step in and say, "Enough." But no one had. He had walked out of that barn alone and carried that silence into manhood. Now, looking at the girl, he felt the echo of that same silence pressing against him, begging for release. The driver cleared his throat, impatient. "She belongs here now." Her father made it clear. Best not to question it. With that, he climbed back onto the wagon, snapped the reins, and disappeared down the road, leaving only the fading sound of hooves and the sharp bite of the cold. The girl did not watch him go. Her eyes stayed low, fixed on the ground, as though she already knew there would be no rescue, no turning back. The rancher felt a heaviness settle in his chest. Inside, questions turned like grinding stones. What was he meant to do with her? He had not asked for this. He had his land, his children, his quiet grief that filled the nights when no one was watching. Another burden was not what he sought, yet here she was, placed at his doorstep by the will of another man. He thought of sending her away, telling her father she was too young, too fragile, that his home had no room for another broken soul. But when he looked again, he saw the hollowness in her eyes, the kind that came from being unwanted for too long. He knew if he turned her away, she would not survive it. The boy shifted closer to his sister, his jaw tight, his eyes wary of the strand. Jer. The girl, the new bride, glanced once at the children, and something softened in her gaze, almost invisible, but real. The rancher noticed. It was not love, not even comfort, but a flicker, a faint recognition of what it meant to stand small before a world too large. He exhaled slowly, the breath misting in the cold. He could walk away, keep his distance, let the arrangement be nothing more than paper and silence. No one would blame him for it. But then he thought again of that boy in the barn, his own boyhood, the ache of abandonment that still lived in his bones. He could not condemn her to the same emptiness. With a slow heaviness, he made his choice, though it did not come with ease or joy. "Come inside," he said at last, his voice low but firm. The girl looked up for the first time, startled not by the words, but by the fact that someone had spoken to her with no edge of cruelty. She hesitated, then stepped toward the cabin. The children moved aside, watching her carefully. The rancher turned, leading them all back to the house. It was not a welcome, not yet. It was a beginning, carved out of silence and necessity, but beneath it lay a quiet vow. He would not let her be destroyed here. The cabin walls carried silence for days, the kind of silence that pressed against the skin until it became part of the air itself. The girl moved carefully within it, sweeping floors that were already clean, folding blankets twice over, fetching water even when no one asked. She never raised her voice, never looked directly at the rancher, and spoke only in whispers when the children lingered close. The boy watched her with suspicion, his arms crossed as though guarding the house from an intruder, while the little girl, with her ragged doll, followed her with quiet fascination. The rancher noticed the patterns and kept his distance, though his eyes never left her for long. The thing about her fear felt unfinished, as though it was not only the forced marriage that weighed on her, but something darker that had followed her here. It was late one evening when the truth began to show itself. A knock rattled the door, sharp and demanding, and when the rancher opened it, a man stood on the porch, broad, red-faced, reeking of drink, his eyes sharp and cruel. The rancher knew him without needing a name. This was the father. The girl stiffened where she stood by the fire, her hands frozen around a pot she had been carrying. The man's gaze fell on her with ownership, not affection. "Just making sure she made it here," he said, his tone thick with mockery. "She ain't worth much, but she'll keep your house warm. Don't expect more than that." His words lingered like poison in the room. The rancher felt anger coil inside him, but he held it down, his voice low. "She's here now. That's all that matters." The man smirked, stepped closer, and lowered his voice so only the rancher could hear. "Don't think you're getting her for free. I still got debts. Men'll be coming to collect, and they'll come looking for her if I can't pay." He spat on the ground, then turned, leaving as abruptly as he arrived. The sound of his boots crunching on frozen dirt faded into the night, but the threat did not fade with him. It lingered, heavy and sharp, a promise of danger still to come. That night, after the children were asleep, the rancher sat at the table, his head in his hands. Pieces of the puzzle came together slowly, each heavier than the last. The girl had not been married off for honor or for care. She had been traded to settle a score. Her father's debts hung over her like chains, and now those chains had been dragged into the rancher's home. He looked at her across the table, her face pale in the firelight, her body drawn tight with fear. She knew it too. Her silence was not just shyness, but survival. She had lived with men like her father, men who treated her as currency, and now she feared the next wave that would come. The rancher clenched his fists, his mind restless. He had fought storms, hunger and loss, but men with debts and violence were different. They came like wolves, tearing at what little peace remained. He wanted to tell her it would be all right, that the children would be safe, that she would not be taken again. But he could not offer promises built on air. The land was wide, but news traveled fast, and men chasing money never lost a trail. He felt time shorten, the horizon close in. Danger was coming, and he knew it would not be long before it arrived at his door. The days that followed were still marked by silence, but it was no longer the same kind of silence. It was softer now, as if the air itself had begun to bend toward something unspoken between them. The girl rose early, her bare feet brushing the cold floorboards as she moved through the cabin with quiet purpose. She cooked simple meals, mended the boy's torn shirt, brushed the little girl's tangled hair, all without being asked. The rancher watched from a distance, noticing how the children began to orbit her without realizing it. The boy, though wary, accepted the repaired shirt without complaint. The little girl pressed her doll into the new woman's lap one evening, a gesture that meant more than any words. These were not declarations, but small, careful steps of trust. One morning, the rancher found her standing at the edge of the corral, watching the horses as they moved inside the pen. Her hands were clasped together, her eyes fixed on the animals as though she longed for something she could not name. He walked to her side and handed her the old rifle he carried slung over his shoulder. She looked at it with hesitation, her lips parting as though to protest, but he said nothing. Instead, he loaded a single round and pointed toward a log at the far end of the field. She held the rifle awkwardly, the weight too much for her thin arms, but he stepped behind her, steadying the barrel with his hand. She did not flinch when his hand brushed hers, though her breath caught in her chest. Together they aimed, and when the shot cracked, through the morning air the sound startled even the horses. The log splintered. She lowered the rifle slowly, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed the hint of a smile to touch her lips. It was faint, but it was real. That night, when the children were asleep, she sat near the fire, rubbing her wrist absent-mindedly where faint bruises still lingered. The rancher noticed, though she did not see him watching. He looked at his own hands, scarred and weathered from rope burns, fights, and work that never seemed to end. He remembered the lash of his father's belt, the years of silence he had endured, and how pain had carved him into something he had never chosen to be. She did not need to tell him her story. It was written on her skin, in the way she avoided sudden movements, in the way she always looked down before she looked up. He saw himself in her. She was younger, yes, but the same wounds lived in both of them, carried from different homes, but cut from the same cloth of cruelty. For a moment the firelight softened the cabin, and it felt as though the world outside did not exist. She reached across the table, not to touch him, but to set down a piece of bread she had saved for him. It was such a small thing, but it was an offering of care, of recognition, of a bond neither had dared to name. He took it without words, meeting her eyes briefly, and in that silence something passed between them. It was not love, not yet, but it was the fragile thread of two broken souls beginning to weave something whole. The prairie outside was still, the night wind pressing gently against the windows. For the first time in many years, the rancher felt the weight in his chest shift. It did not disappear, but it eased, as though sharing space with someone who carried her own sorrow made his more bearable. In her presence, and in the way she quietly tended to what was Bro's, he felt the faintest trace of peace, the kind that comes before the storm, fragile and fleeting, yet enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, they were not as lost as they thought. The storm arrived without thunder, only the rumble of hooves across the frozen ground. The boy was the first to hear it, his head lifting from his chores as his eyes grew wide. The rancher stepped outside and saw them. 3 men on horseback riding hard toward the cabin, their faces set, rifles strapped to their saddles. Dust rose behind them like a warning, and the rancher's gut clenched with the certainty that this moment had been closing in since the night her father appeared at his door. The girl stood in the doorway, her face drained of color, her hands twisting together until her knuckles whitened. She did not need to ask who they were. She already knew. The men dismounted roughly, their boots thudding on the earth, their movements practiced and cruel. The largest of them spat into the dirt before speaking. "Her old man owes more than he can pay. She's worth something to us. We're here to collect." His eyes moved over her like she was livestock, and when she shrank back, the little girl clung to her skirt, refusing to let go. The boy stood stiff, his fists balled, though he was no match for grown men. The rancher stepped forward, his shoulders squared, his hand resting on the worn handle of his rifle. "This is my land," he said quietly. "You'll turn around now and leave." The words were steady, but the air crackled with the weight of what was coming. The men laughed, not the laugh of humor, but of contempt. One reached toward his holster, and in that instant the stillness shattered. The rancher raised his rifle, cocking it with a sound that cut through the cold morning. The standoff froze time itself. The girl pulled the children back into the shadows of the doorway. Her body shaking, though she forced herself to stand in front of them like a shield. One of the men sneered, stepping forward. "You willing to die for someone else's debt?" The rancher's jaw tightened. He had lived too many years with silence, with the weight of things he wished someone had once done for him. Now, at last, the choice was his. He shifted his grip, eyes locked on the man, ready to risk everything. The twist came like a knife of truth. The girl, who had been silent for days, spoke, her voice raw and breaking, but strong enough to carry. "I'm not worth money," she said, her eyes burning. "But I know where he hides it. My father. The debts you chase. He lies about them." The men faltered, their eyes narrowing as they processed her words. Rage and greed flickered together, uncertain where to settle. The rancher turned his head slightly, shocked that she had spoken at all. It was not fear that drove her words, but the will to protect the children, to draw the danger away from them. The largest man snarled and lunged forward, grabbing her arm. Before the rancher thought, the rifle cracked. The shot rang across the prairie, and the man stumbled back, blood blooming dark against his coat. The other 2 drew their weapons, chaos breaking loose in the yard. The rancher fired again, grazing one, while the boy, desperate, hurled a stone that struck the other square in the face. The fight was raw, brutal, and the rancher moved with the certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose, but everything left to protect. By the end, the ground was stained, and the silence of the land returned heavy and thick. The rancher stood breathing hard, his rifle empty, his body trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what he had chosen. The girl clutched the children close, her eyes wide with shock, but alive. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then, slowly, the rancher lowered the rifle, his eyes finding hers across the distance. In that gaze lived the truth. He had risked his life not for obligation, not for debt, but because she mattered. She and the children were his now, and no man would take them away. The prairie was quiet again, but it was not the kind of quiet that brought peace. Smoke still lingered faintly from the rifle shots, drifting above the yard like a shadow that would not leave. The largest of the men lay still in the dirt, his breath gone, his hand curled around nothing. One of the others limped away, clutching his arm, leaving streaks of blood behind as he staggered toward his horse. The third, dazed from the stone the boy had thrown, crawled up onto his saddle, his face pale with pain. Neither of them looked back. Fear had replaced greed, and the echo of what they had found here was enough to send them into the horizon. Only the fallen remained, silent as the earth swallowed the sound of hooves fading into distance. The rancher stood over the body for a long while, the rifle loose in his hand, the weight of what he had done pressing down with every breath. He had not killed for glory, nor for pride. He had killed because the choice had been made for him long before this day. By a father's cruelty, by debts traded in shadows, by the helpless eyes of a girl who had been treated as nothing more than a bargain. The land seemed to understand, holding the moment in its vast, cold silence. Behind him, the children clung to the girl, their small hands gripping her dress, as though she was the only thing that could keep them upright. She did not cry, though her eyes shone in the firelight that flickered from the cabin. Instead, she reached down and pulled them closer, pressing her cheek to the top of the little girl's head. For the first time since she had arrived, her touch carried no hesitation. She belonged with them now, though the cost had been paid in blood. The rancher dragged the man's body to the far edge of the field before digging into the frozen ground with slow, heavy strokes of the shovel. The dirt was hard, resisting him with every thrust, but he did not stop. Sweat stung his eyes despite the cold, and the muscles in his arms burned. When the grave was finally deep enough, he lowered the man into it without ceremony. There were no prayers, no words spoken, only the dull thud of earth striking against wood and flesh. Each shovelful of dirt sounded louder than the last, echoing in the still air until the grave was full. He stood there for a long while after, his chest heaving, the shovel still in his hand, before turning back to the cabin. Inside, the fire burned low. The girl sat at the table with the children pressed against her, their eyes heavy but unwilling to close. When the rancher stepped through the door, no one spoke. The silence said more than words could. She met his gaze briefly, and though her lips did not move, her eyes carried something he had never seen in them before. Trust. He nodded once, setting the rifle against the wall. Then he sat across from them, letting the stillness hold them all together. The night deepened, heavy with exhaustion and unspoken truths. Outside, the wind whispered over the prairie, carrying away the sound of violence and leaving behind only the fragile breath of survival. For now, they were safe. For now, the danger had passed. And in that fragile quiet, the broken pieces of 4 lives began to fit together, not perfectly, but enough to keep the fire alive. Winter passed slowly, each day carving away the memory of violence until only faint scars remained on the land. The grave at the edge of the field grew soft with grass, the wind smoothing the soil as though the earth itself wanted to cover what had happened there. No one spoke of it, not the rancher, not the girl, not even the boy who had once glared at her with suspicion. Life did not forget, but it moved forward, step by quiet step, like a wagon wheel turning along a long road. The girl was no longer the frightened shadow who had stepped off the wagon months before. She moved with steadier hands now, her back straighter, her gaze no longer fixed on the ground. The children had begun to follow her not just with curiosity but with trust. The boy, once guarded, now stood beside her when chores demanded 2 sets of hands. The little girl, who had clung to her ragged doll, sometimes left it behind in favor of holding the young woman's hand instead. Slowly, without fanfare, a family had begun to stitch itself together from the torn fabric of what once was broken. The rancher carried himself differently too. He still woke before dawn, still worked the land until his muscles ached, but the hollowness in his eyes had softened. He no longer ate alone at the table, no longer spent nights staring at a cold fire that gave no warmth. There were moments, small but steady, when laughter crept into the cabin. The clatter of a dropped pot, the squeal of a child chasing chickens, the startled smile of the girl who had once forgotten how to smile at all. These moments did not erase the past, but they gave it meaning, as though suffering had led them all here for a reason only silence could explain. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, the rancher walked with her to the grave at the field's edge. They stood together without speaking, the children playing near the fence. She bent down and set a single wildflower on the mound of earth, her fingers brushing the grass. The rancher watched her, and in her quiet gesture, he saw the truth. She had not only survived, she had chosen to live, to honor what was lost by protecting what was now hers. The wind stirred gently, carrying the sound of the children's laughter across the prairie. He reached for her hand, and this time she did not pull away. The land around them was vast, empty, and cold. But within that silence, there was warmth, fragile, imperfect, but real. And as the sun slipped behind the horizon, it felt as though the world itself had paused, leaving only one truth echoing so. Softly in the air, broken things can still build a home.